It began not with gunshots, but with silence. Hundreds of trucks lined up under the scorching West African sun, engines off, goods rotting. Fish meant to feed families now spoiled. Drivers, men who have spent decades crisscrossing borders to feed their own children, stood helpless. At the heart of this paralysis was a decision. Burkina Faso had closed the gate, not with a formal war declaration, but with a quiet, calculated regulation. No trucks longer than 54 feet would be allowed to pass from Ghana. The rule came down fast, without warning. Some drivers were ordered to physically cut their trucks to meet the size limit. Others were told they had to pay 500,000 CFA francs, or roughly 10,000 Ghanaian cedis, just to move forward. If they couldn't, their journey and their business ended there. For 2 weeks they waited. Some protested. Many prayed. Few slept. But what turned this blockade from a bureaucratic inconvenience into a story that shook the region was what happened next. President Ibrahim Traoré, not in a suit, but in military fatigues, showed up at the border himself. What message was he trying to send, not just to terrorists, but to Ghana and, perhaps, to the West? Was this about national security, or was it something bigger? A warning. If you believe in justice, security, and truth in Africa, subscribe now. Join us as we uncover the stories the world chooses to ignore. Because the silence at the border was never just silence. It was the sound of something shifting, a deeper fracture, a question that West Africa must now confront. When does protecting a nation become isolating it? The border crisis did not unfold in whispers. It erupted in frustration, confusion, and financial despair. Over 232 commercial trucks, mostly from Ghana, were stopped at the Paga border crossing. The reason? A sudden enforcement of a new rule. Any vehicle exceeding 54 feet in length was no longer allowed to enter Burkina Faso. No prior announcement. No adjustment period. No explanation, just cold enforcement. For many of these truck drivers, this route was their lifeline, both personally and professionally. One of them, Daniel Owusu, age 47, had been hauling fish from Accra to Ouagadougou for over 15 years. A father of 4, Daniel had just borrowed money to upgrade his truck to handle larger loads and keep up with the competition. But that investment turned to dust. When he reached the border, he was told his truck was too long. He had 2 options: cut the truck, literally slice off a portion to comply with the new rule, or pay the equivalent of 500,000 CFA francs to be allowed through. Daniel had neither the means nor the heart to destroy the very truck that fed his family. So he waited. For 14 days, his refrigerated cargo slowly spoiled. By the end of the second week, he had lost everything. He wasn't alone. Drivers began protesting, not violently but visibly. They gathered in the hundreds, parking their trucks across the road, blocking other vehicles and demanding answers. Some carried signs accusing the authorities of extortion. Others, like Daniel, simply stood in silence, staring at their rotting cargo, unable to speak. As the trucks sat idle, tension mounted. Local markets in Ghana reported rising food prices: fish, yams, tomatoes, all affected by the disruption. Traders feared that if the situation continued, the economic shock could ripple far beyond the border towns. Meanwhile, on the Burkina Faso side, border authorities were firm. They cited security concerns as justification. Terrorist groups, they claimed, were using commercial routes to smuggle weapons, drugs, even fighters. The long trucks, they argued, made it easier to hide dangerous materials. Whether true or not, this explanation did little to comfort the stranded drivers. Many saw it as a political move disguised as a security measure. Some began to question whether Burkina Faso's crackdown was truly about safety, or about sending a signal to Ghana. Behind the scenes, reports circulated that this new policy had come directly from the top, reinforced personally by President Ibrahim Traoré. What made the situation even more extraordinary was not just the regulation, but how it was implemented. The lack of communication between the two nations raised serious diplomatic questions. Why wasn't Ghana informed beforehand? Why wasn't there a grace period or even a temporary exemption for existing traffic? Ghanaian authorities appeared caught off guard. In interviews, several officials admitted they had no idea such a policy was coming. Drivers demanded action from their own government, asking why they were left alone to deal with the chaos. Meanwhile, frustration spilled over into the streets. At one point, angry drivers began deliberately targeting perishable food trucks, blocking them in protest, not out of malice, but desperation. The idea was simple. If the food spoils, pressure builds. And it worked. Within days, the protest caught international attention. Media outlets began covering the blockade, raising questions about regional trade, the future of ECOWAS, and the fragile balance between security and commerce in West Africa. Radio interviews featured mothers who couldn't buy fish, restaurant owners who lost inventory, and exporters who missed international shipping deadlines. One chilling anecdote came from a driver who said, "We are treated like threats, not traders. But if we break, so does the economy." What had begun as a technical regulation had now escalated into a regional crisis. Trucks remained stuck, drivers remained stranded, and public anger grew. But what transformed this story from a tragic economic standoff into a geopolitical flashpoint was yet to come. Because President Traoré didn't just order the regulation, he stepped into the spotlight. Personally, and what he did next sent shockwaves across the continent. But what was the motive behind this bold move? Was it fear, strategy, or something more calculated? What message was he trying to deliver to his people, to Ghana, and to the world? That's what we'll uncover next. Because what happened next didn't just shift policy, it shifted perception. And when a leader walks the front lines, it often means the stakes are far higher than we imagine. But what exactly did President Traoré do that changed everything? While the drivers protested in the heat and goods continued to rot, something unexpected happened. President Ibrahim Traoré arrived, not in a blacked-out SUV, not in polished shoes and a tailored suit, but in combat boots, field fatigues, and a bulletproof vest. Cameras captured him walking alongside soldiers, shaking hands, inspecting defenses, and even pointing toward the horizon where threats were said to emerge. His presence wasn't symbolic, it was tactical. Traoré stood before the troops and spoke with conviction. "You are not just guards," he said. "You are warriors at the front line of our survival. If I am here with you, it is because I take the same risks you do. Leaders must walk with their men." The speech was televised. It was raw, unfiltered, filled with pauses, firm stares, and emotional weight. Traoré told the soldiers that the battle was not just over territory. It was over the future of Burkina Faso. He reminded them of towns lost to terrorists, of lives disrupted, and of families clinging to hope. "Reconquering is good," he said, "but now we must consolidate. These people see in you their only hope for life. Give them that hope." That moment, caught on national television and replayed across social media, became the turning point. For many Burkinabe citizens, it was a powerful reminder of leadership rooted in sacrifice and solidarity. Images of Traoré kneeling with soldiers, walking through dusty border zones, and addressing units directly became iconic. In marketplaces and mosques, his words were quoted. In army barracks, morale surged. Among ordinary citizens, however, reactions were more complex. Some saw him as a patriotic leader, doing what no president before him had done, risking his life to secure the nation. Others, especially traders and transporters, felt betrayed. For them, the economic pain was real, immediate, and crushing. In the border town of Po, a small business owner named Adama recounted how his store, once bustling with truckers and travelers, had gone silent. "There is pride," he said, "but also hunger. And hunger does not wait for speeches." Meanwhile, in Ghana, the atmosphere was tense. News of Traoré's border visit spread quickly, and local media portrayed it with skepticism. Analysts debated whether this was truly about security or a broader political maneuver. "What's the real target here?" one commentator asked. "Terrorists? Or Ghana's growing friendship with the United States?" Some pointed out that Traoré's military posture coincided with Ghana's recent defense cooperation agreements with Washington, including surveillance support and regional coordination. Could Burkina Faso be interpreting Ghana's openness to the West as a threat to its own sovereignty? On the streets of Accra, public opinion began to divide. Some supported a hardline stance, calling for Ghana to reinforce its borders and assert itself. Others feared escalation. The last thing West Africa needed, many argued, was a new Cold War between neighbors. In the midst of this, international actors remained largely quiet. ECOWAS offered statements of concern but took no firm action. The African Union said it was monitoring the situation. The United States, careful not to inflame tensions, issued a brief statement affirming its commitment to regional stability. But in the silence of diplomacy, the visuals of Traoré at the border spoke louder than any communiqué. He wasn't just addressing soldiers, he was speaking to the world. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would protect itself on its own terms, regardless of who it offended. For many older Americans watching this unfold, the imagery evoked something deeply familiar. A time when leadership meant presence, not just politics. Some drew parallels to Eisenhower visiting troops or Roosevelt's fireside chats during uncertain times. In Traoré's actions, they saw echoes of an old-fashioned ideal, that a leader's place is with his people, especially in times of crisis. But others warned of something darker. They cautioned that when military uniforms replace diplomacy, when public fear is used to justify sweeping action, democracy can slowly erode. And so, as the dust settled at the border and the trucks remained lined up under the sun, a new question began to rise. Not just in Africa, but globally. What happens when a president blends patriotism with militarism? Where is the line between leadership and control? And if that line disappears, who draws it back? The world watched as Traoré walked the border, but few noticed the path he was paving beneath his boots. Was it one of national revival or regional rupture? That answer, still unclear, depended on what would come next, because the reaction to Traoré's actions had only just begun to ripple outward, and the international implications were far from over. The world was watching, but would it act? As the days dragged on and the border remained partially locked, the economic and social shockwaves became impossible to ignore. What began as a policy targeting vehicle length evolved into a crisis that strained everyday life across two nations. In Ghana, perishable goods spoiled on idle trucks, driving prices upward in local markets. Tomatoes doubled in price in Kumasi. Fish vanished from freezers in Tamale. Even in Accra's coastal markets, once flush with fresh seafood, vendors began rationing supplies. The economic engine of cross-border trade had sputtered, and families were paying the price. Small business owners who relied on consistent transport from Burkina Faso began closing early. In the town of Techiman, a food wholesaler named Mrs. Evelyn Mensah described watching 3 refrigerated trucks of imported vegetables turn to waste in a matter of days. "It wasn't just money we lost," she said. "It was trust. My customers now think I'm unreliable. They don't care that it's a border issue. They care that dinner didn't get served. In Burkina Faso, the story was similar but colored by pride and quiet suffering. Traders in border towns were caught in the middle, unable to receive deliveries from Ghana, yet hesitant to speak out for fear of appearing disloyal to the national cause. The silence was heavy. In Ouagadougou, a bakery owner named Salif, who once imported flour from Ghana, shared that he now pays 3 times more for inferior local alternatives. "We support the president," he said carefully, "but our survival is being tested." Meanwhile, politically, the border crisis opened a rift between administrations. Ghana's government, facing mounting pressure from both opposition figures and business coalitions, began quietly reaching out through diplomatic back channels. But the official response remained subdued. No leader wanted to appear weak. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's administration doubled down. State media portrayed the border control as a successful act of sovereignty. Nationalist slogans were broadcast on television. Military officials were praised. And across social media, young Burkinabe proudly shared images of their president with captions like, "Our shield, our sword." Yet not all were convinced. Within Burkina's political circles, murmurs of dissent began to surface. Some critics worried that the economic damage could spiral beyond control. Others feared that rising public frustration, if not addressed, could weaken the very unity Traoré sought to build. There were early signs of unrest in the north, where the economy was more tightly tied to cross-border trade. Even soldiers, hailed as heroes in the media, privately expressed concern that without food and fuel flowing normally, morale might crack. And then came the incident that underscored just how fragile the situation had become. In Bobo Dioulasso, a small group of traders staged a silent protest, laying baskets of spoiled produce on the steps of a local government office. No signs, no shouting, just decay on display. Within hours, the area was cleared. But the message was clear. Food speaks louder than flags. In Ghana, the ripple effects became political ammunition. Opposition leaders accused the ruling party of failing to protect Ghanaian interests and letting Burkina Faso dominate the narrative. Parliament saw heated debates. Talk shows turned combative. Citizens called for economic retaliation, suggesting Ghana implement its own trade restrictions. But wiser voices warned against escalation. Economists highlighted how even temporary disruptions were costing both nations millions in lost productivity and supply chain damage. A report from the West African Policy Center estimated over $10 million in economic losses within just 3 weeks of the border action. Yet beyond the numbers, the emotional toll weighed heavier. Families split between the two countries couldn't visit loved ones. Students commuting for school found themselves stranded. Religious pilgrimages were postponed. Even cultural festivals planned to celebrate regional unity were quietly canceled. In every way that mattered, the border wasn't just a checkpoint, it had become a wall. And that wall was growing taller. Still, through it all, the people remained remarkably patient. There were no mass riots, no widespread looting, just questions. Quiet, persistent, and deeply human. Will life ever return to normal? Is the price of national pride too high? And most importantly, how long can ordinary people carry the burden of decisions made far above their heads? These questions echoed across living rooms, mosques, churches, and community halls. They weren't questions of politics, but of survival. And as tension simmered beneath the surface, the one question on everyone's mind was this: what will the United States do now? In Washington, the crisis unfolding at the Ghana-Burkina Faso border barely made headlines. But within the halls of the Pentagon and the State Department, it did not go unnoticed. Intelligence briefings circulated quietly, pointing to what analysts called a localized flashpoint with long-range implications. At its surface, the issue looked like a border regulation dispute. But underneath, U.S. policymakers saw something far more complex: a growing divergence in the Sahel's political alignment and a potential unraveling of America's influence in the region. For years, Ghana had been the dependable partner, stable, democratic, and increasingly open to Western defense cooperation. In contrast, Burkina Faso, especially under President Ibrahim Traoré, was drifting further from the West. Since taking power, Traoré had aligned more closely with other Sahel military governments, expressing sharp criticism of French and American involvement in African security. His rhetoric was often blunt, nationalist, and laced with suspicion. And now, with the border crackdown, that suspicion had become action. Some U.S. officials believed Traoré's move wasn't just about terrorism or border safety. It was a deliberate signal. Ghana's growing ties to Washington, especially the new Joint Security Coordination Program announced in early 2025, had triggered alarm bells in Ouagadougou. The program, which included U.S. support for satellite surveillance, intelligence sharing, and limited training of Ghanaian forces, was meant to strengthen regional security. But from Burkina Faso's perspective, it looked like the early stages of a Western security umbrella that excluded them, and potentially exposed them. The border closure in this light was not just a safety measure. It was a line drawn in the sand. Some within the U.S. intelligence community warned that Burkina Faso could be laying the groundwork for a new Sahel bloc, aligned with Russia, skeptical of the West, and aggressively nationalist in tone. Niger and Mali had already moved in that direction. If Burkina Faso followed fully, the center of gravity in West Africa could shift. Publicly, the United States issued only a restrained statement. We encourage dialogue between our regional partners and reaffirm our commitment to peaceful cooperation, a spokesperson said. But internally, the mood was more urgent. Diplomatic cables showed concern that the U.S. might be facing a strategic squeeze. On one side, Ghana, willing to cooperate but now vulnerable to retaliation. On the other, Burkina Faso, resolute, unpredictable, and unafraid of the confrontation. European allies voiced similar concerns. France, once the dominant force in West Africa, had seen its presence shrink rapidly. Now, watching American influence challenged in Ghana, French analysts warned that the West might be losing the region not through defeat, but neglect. Meanwhile, Russia's state-backed media celebrated Traoré's stance as an act of true African sovereignty. Chinese outlets offered restrained praise, framing the move as part of a broader shift toward multipolar cooperation. Burkina Faso, once overlooked on the geopolitical chessboard, was suddenly at the center. But the real question remained: how far would Traoré go? And how would America respond, not just to him but to the larger strategic question the crisis posed? Was U.S. involvement in West Africa still welcome, or was it becoming a liability to its partners? For ordinary Americans, the story was distant, abstract. But for U.S. veterans, diplomats, and policy watchers, especially those with experience in Africa, the implications were clear. If alliances in the region fractured, terrorism could find new ground, smuggling routes could expand, migration pressures could grow, and opportunities for rivals, Russia, China, even Iran, to fill the vacuum would multiply. Yet the response wasn't just about statecraft. It was also moral. Was the United States willing to support partners like Ghana when they came under pressure from neighbors? Or would it retreat, afraid to inflame tensions? That moral clarity, or lack of it, would define how America was perceived not just in West Africa, but across the global South. In the meantime, Ghanaians waited. Traders continued losing money. Families grew anxious, and Burkina Faso, resolute in its silence, pressed on with its border enforcement. No apology. No rollback. No sign of compromise. The silence from Ouagadougou was loud, but perhaps even louder was the uncertainty in Washington. What happens when an ally is tested and the response is hesitation? What signal does that send? To friends, to foes, to the people caught in between? Because one thing was now certain. This wasn't just about trucks at a border. It was about strategy, sovereignty, and a new question echoing across the Sahel. If the U.S. doesn't step in now, will it be welcome when it finally does? Behind the barbed wire and policy memos, beyond the convoys and public speeches, something far more calculated was taking shape. The crisis at the Ghana-Burkina Faso border was not just the result of fear or security concerns. It was a maneuver, carefully designed, politically loaded, and brutally effective. Inside Ouagadougou, government insiders began to reveal the layers beneath the official narrative. According to sources within Burkina Faso's Ministry of Security, the decision to impose border restrictions had been debated for months, long before the recent terrorist alerts. What pushed it forward wasn't new intelligence. It was political calculus. President Traoré, once seen as a bold military reformer, now faced growing pressure from hardliners within his own ranks. Since consolidating power, Traoré had walked a delicate tightrope, balancing public support, military loyalty, and ideological clarity. His inner circle, composed largely of military officers, had grown impatient with what they perceived as passive regional diplomacy. They wanted action. They wanted to draw lines. The border decision gave them just that. It wasn't just about stopping potential threats. It was about testing Ghana's response, challenging ECOWAS authority, and signaling to Washington that Burkina Faso would not be treated as a junior partner in the region. For Traoré, the optics were perfect. A direct visit to the border, soldiers at his side, national pride in full display. But behind that strongman image was a campaign carefully choreographed by his political strategists. Local state media had been prepped. Influencers tied to the government flooded social platforms with pro-Traoré narratives. Hashtags like Oitu Souveraineté d'abord, Sovereignty First, and Traoré avec le peuple, Traoré with the people, trended across Francophone Africa. Yet not all were convinced. Within Burkina's opposition circles, some accused the president of manufacturing crisis to distract from domestic stagnation. When prices rise and promises fade, one critic said, leaders reach for flags. These voices, however, were marginalized. Traoré's popularity remained strong, especially among younger Burkinabé, frustrated with decades of corruption, dependency, and foreign control. The border closure to them was not economic suicide, it was emancipation. But this defiance came at a cost. Internal documents leaked to a regional media outlet revealed that Burkina Faso had anticipated a diplomatic backlash from Ghana and ECOWAS. Contingency plans were already in place. Economic buffers, fuel reserves, and propaganda scripts aimed at shifting blame outward. The strategy was clear: provoke, hold firm, and force others to either bend or break. From a political science lens, this was classic controlled escalation. By creating a problem that only Traoré could solve, he amplified his centrality in the national narrative. Every headline, every protest, every debate looped back to him. Love him or hate him, he was the story. But such centralization of power carried risk. Dissent, once expressed through debate, began retreating underground. Journalists hesitated to probe too deeply. Civic groups scaled back their activities. And a sense of silence, a silence heavy with caution, began to spread in professional circles. One political analyst in Ouagadougou, speaking on condition of anonymity, said, "We are watching the rise of a new consensus, one built not on votes but on control." And in that space, borders are not just geographical, they're psychological. Ghana, meanwhile, began suspecting deeper motives. Security officials there pointed to the timing of the regulation, which followed weeks after Ghana signed new cooperation agreements with U.S. defense advisors. Was this retaliation masked as regulation? And if so, what did it mean for future agreements across the region? Would every step toward Western alignment come with political cost? The concern wasn't hypothetical. Other West African nations were watching. If Burkina Faso succeeded in asserting dominance through unilateral moves, would others follow? Would Mali impose new rules on Ivory Coast? Would Niger shut down corridors to Nigeria? A chain reaction could unravel decades of delicate integration. And that fear was real. Inside ECOWAS, urgency grew, but unity did not. Member states remained split between those favoring dialogue and those calling for disciplinary measures. Without a unified front, Traoré's gamble looked increasingly safe. The longer he held the line, the more the regional order bent toward him. And that, perhaps, was the quiet genius of the entire move. It wasn't just about trucks or Ghana or the United States. It was about power. Its projection, its preservation, and its performance. Traoré wasn't just defending borders. He was redefining them. But in a region still healing from coups, civil wars, and colonial trauma, the question now was clear. How much consolidation is too much? When does strength become suppression? And if the center continues to tighten, how long before the edges begin to crack? What started as a simple policy on truck length has now become a geopolitical stress test for the entire West African region. The crisis at the Ghana-Burkina Faso border is no longer about regulations. It is about trust, sovereignty, and survival. And the longer it persists, the more fragile the regional architecture becomes. ECOWAS, once envisioned as a bridge between nations, now finds itself trapped between diplomacy and division. The vision of open trade, shared growth, and African unity is colliding head-on with a rising wave of nationalism, suspicion, and security-first politics. Burkina Faso may be the first to act boldly, but it might not be the last. If Traoré's defiance brings no real consequences, other governments facing internal pressures may follow suit. Borders could harden, economies could fragment, and the people, traders, drivers, students, mothers, would pay the price. The streets may still be quiet, but beneath that quiet lies a growing unease. A border has been drawn, but so has a battle line. Not between armies, but between visions of what West Africa should become. One vision clings to tradition, sovereignty, and self-determination, unapologetically African. The other holds fast to cooperation, connectivity, and shared prosperity. Both claim to speak for the people, but can both survive? The coming months will be decisive. If the tension is not diffused, we could see retaliations, policy escalations, and even the collapse of trade frameworks that took decades to build. Already, there are whispers of coordinated blockades, of neighbors preparing contingency plans, of international actors recalibrating their bets. And so we ask, is President Traoré the protector of a proud nation or the architect of a continental rupture? Is this a necessary recalibration of African sovereignty or a dangerous descent into division? And above all, what role will the United States play? Will it lead with integrity or watch from the sidelines? The answers, as always, lie not in headlines, but in people. People like Daniel the truck driver, like Adama the shopkeeper, like you. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in dignity, sovereignty, and the rise of a proud Africa, comment below, share this message, and subscribe. We'll meet again in the next story, where the truth still speaks. May God bless West Africa, the land of strength, hope, and unbroken will. Because in times like these, silence is not neutral. It is a choice, and every choice we make today shapes the Africa we leave behind tomorrow.